Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. In my previous two videos, we discussed how piano playing of the first part of the 19th century relied on finger legato with a very discrete use of the sustain pedal, which was relegated to particular effects. We saw how Chopin, who was born in an era in which the sustain pedal was a relatively new invention, notated its use profusely in some pieces and very sparingly in others. The amount of pedal used was based on the intention of the writing in a piece. In case the left hand presented accompaniments where arpeggiated figurations were not designed to be played within a hand position, meaning if the distance between the bass note and the rest of the accompanying figuration was too broad, then the pedal was used almost systematically. In other pieces, the pedal indications may be few, sometimes even very few. But there's a reason behind it. The left hand is able to reach and connect successfully, and the use of the pedal is considered unnecessary. It's important to mention again that pianos had damper mechanisms that did not immediately stop the vibration of the strings, unlike modern pianos. The veiled resonance that emerged helped in connecting notes or chords that today would sound choppy or clunky if played without the use of the sustain pedal. I'd like to offer a few examples of how unpedaled writing is featured in quite a few pieces in which pianists use generous amounts of pedal, and how in those very pieces the pedal that Chopin indicated is relegated to a specific property, that of connecting unreachable intervals, and only rarely does it actually enter the picture to create a special effect. I'll begin with the prelude in E minor, opus 28, number 4. Here, the pedal is indicated only for two specific moments in the piece, in measures 17 and measure 18. Not coincidentally, in both moments, the left hand would not be able to hold the bass and reach the chord that follows, and needs the intervention of the pedal. We can therefore assume that Chopin envisioned the use of the pedal exclusively to create that connection, and that the rest of the prelude was intended to be played by using the physical connection of the left-hand chords. Today, no one, at least not that I've heard, plays this prelude without the continuous use of the sustain pedal, and it's understandable. The veiled resonance that emerged from pianos in the 1830s, unavoidable, which helped in connecting the left-hand chords, is no longer a feature of modern pianos. Over the decades, piano playing has progressively dispensed with the extreme legato that was a proud feature of early 19th century piano schools, because the elimination of that built-in resonance, once a prominent element in the natural sound of pianos, prompted an increasing use of the sustain pedal, and the extreme legato became, by and large, dispensable. In my previous video, I also mentioned the use of what we call half pedal to emulate the veiled resonance produced by pianos from the 1830s and 40s. In the prelude in E minor, we could try to use this technique to represent the effect, but very frequent pedal changes, possibly even for each eighth note and the accompaniment, might suffice. Perhaps not coincidentally, there is a piece by Chopin in which the writing is strikingly similar to that of the prelude in E minor, the Mazurka in A minor, opus 17, number 4. Their similarities may be a clue that Chopin had already written the prelude, or at least conceived its germinal ideas, when he began to structure the set of 24 preludes which he completed in 1839. In fact, here the strategy is the same. Chords in the left hand, written all within reach and connectable by relying on the veiled resonance on the edge of the release. Then the pedal intervenes when a bass note cannot connect successfully. There are a handful of exceptions to this rule within the mazurka, such as this unpedaled measure in which Chopin, I guess, did not want to connect the bass note in the first beat to the chord in the second beat. In the following phrase, the material is repeated, and here this measure appears varied with a much more active melody. Chopin includes a pedal marking that encompasses the entire measure. My assumption is that here the idea of varying the simpler melody heard earlier also implied the use of the pedal. There is also the possibility that the repeated note in the right hand, in Chopin's mind, would have needed the use of the sustained pedal, hence the inclusion of the pedal in this measure. One marking in particular at the end of the mazurka relies on the sustaining of the harmony of A minor, and it's indicated as a special effect since the A in the bass is meant to last through 5 measures. Remaining in the realm of the 24 Preludes opus 28, the 13th prelude provides insights into the meaning of legato in unpedaled playing. Here, legato as a marking appears for the left hand, just as it did in the Nocturne in F major opus 15 number 1, which we saw in my last video. This time, however, for an accompanying figuration that has melodic aspirations. Here are the opening measures of the manuscript that Chopin prepared as the basis for the first French edition, published by Adolphe Catelan in 1839. The assignment of the marking legato to the left hand is clearly shown in the manuscript. However, the engraver reassigned it to the middle of the system, turning it into a generic indication for both hands. Curiously, in the first printing of the Breitkopf und Härtel edition, published only 2 months before the first French edition and based on a copy of Chopin's manuscript completed by Julien Fontana, we see that Chopin's intentions in the placement of the marking legato under the left hand was also ignored. Just like in the Nocturne in F major, as we study the manuscript of the prelude, it seems clear that Chopin intended for this opening page to rely on the sustained pedal exclusively when the left hand features intervals that cannot be physically connected. In the second half of measure 2, 4, and 10, and in the first half of measure 6, the distance between the bass and the second eighth note of each 16th note group is unreachable for most hands. Everything else would have been left unpedaled. It was then purposeful to alert the performer that that would be the case, that no pedal should be used for this piece unless strictly necessary, and Chopin shows us where. We don't know why the inscription legato found in both manuscripts under the left hand was moved to the middle of the staff by both publishers, but the implications of this decision are relevant because when the marking is placed in the middle of the system, its meaning changes, now implying that both hands be played in legato. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. I guess both hands should be played in legato to represent the character of the piece adequately. But something has been reinterpreted today in our understanding of what this marking means, because we assign all sorts of melodic and expressive connotations to it. As an illustrious pianist described in a recent masterclass I attended, and I'm paraphrasing, legato implies not only that a group of notes be connected, but that they're also given a musical shape. In a pianist, effective legato is the ability to reproduce the nuances of the human voice. As appealing as they are, and perhaps even logical, these are subjective interpretations, superimposed to something so basic as to play without the constant use of the sustained pedal. And perhaps that's why there's a desire to give a meaning at all costs to the marking. I confess that I never gave much thought as to what the marking legato might have originally implied, before understanding that it specifically referred to unpedaled playing. I simply repeated whatever aesthetic notion I was taught by my teachers or by other musicians I heard in master classes, for example, about the term. In the last movement of the sonata in B-flat minor, opus 35, which Chopin completed around the same time as the preludes and published in 1840, Chopin inscribed the beginning with the marking legato. By now, the implications are clear. No pedal is to be used throughout the movement unless otherwise indicated. And in this movement, the pedal is introduced only in the last measure. On 1830s pianos, this writing, mostly relegated to the low and middle registers with no excursions into the upper register, would have produced a constant, gentle haze. In my previous video, I mentioned that we can recreate a similar effect by using what we call half pedal, something whose quantity in reality remains undetermined because it depends on the desired effect. To replicate or at least come close to the effect produced by pedal playing on 1930s instruments, one can use perhaps 10% of the full depression of the sustained pedal and simply hold it down without any release whatsoever. In my performance of the sonata, I combined the use of the half pedal and overholding, the latter to outline some of the melodic aspects that emerge from sequences and chordal structures implied within the writing. Fast forward 4 years, we remain in the context of the sonatas with the sonata in B minor, opus 58, specifically the middle section of the third movement, which features a unique example of written overholding. The extent to which Chopin went to clarify the notes that should be held and for how long, and the ones that shouldn't, is truly extraordinary. Why would Chopin notate the overholding to begin with, and why painstakingly so for so many measures? Because as we see, the section relies on very sparse pedaling, and he chose to clarify which notes should be held rather than hoping that the performer would understand what to do. The writing clarifies that the notes to be held are only those that represent the harmony. And so we see that in the first arpeggiated figuration, for example, the only note that is not held is the F sharp because it's not part of the harmony of E major, E, G sharp, and B. And notating the overholding was even more purposeful here because historically the right hand is rarely in charge of playing accompaniments or harmonic material. We understand how specific the playing of this section should be when we investigate the role of the pedal markings, which are quite sparse, as I mentioned, in particular the first one that Chopin marked in this section. As the left hand holds the fifth EB for the entire duration of the first measure, it wouldn't be able to reach the G sharp on the next downbeat without at least releasing the E and the bass, and so the pedal is introduced for a moment to guarantee that melodic connection, all the while the right hand is providing the backdrop. Today, in this section, most pianists use extended pedal applications, mixing extraneous notes with the main harmonic context. We saw how Chopin strove to avoid precisely that, making sure, in the first measure for example, to eliminate the F sharp from the E major harmony. Yet, this intention is systematically ignored. And while long pedals produce truly beautiful effects, the paradox is that many people consider this section pre-impressionistic, ahead of its time. But isn't it ironic that what makes it pre-impressionistic or ahead of its time is actually the very misunderstanding or ignoring of Chopin's notation, since he never intended to create the premises that make that extraordinary moment pre-impressionistic or ahead of its time. While on the one hand, we might be eager to observe Chopin's notation accurately, very often pedal markings, or as we saw in the case of the Largo from the Sonata in B minor, their absence, are ignored, corrected, modified. And while the score in front of us offers instructions that might not always apply to modern instruments, for example, the unpedaled passages that modern pianists have a hard time relating to, We should perhaps try to understand a composer's intentions instead of dismissing the validity of the pedal markings in the score simply because in the back of our mind the piano has changed without really knowing how it's changed. We hear Chopin's beloved Pleyels and may understand and appreciate the advantages of the gentle resonance that accompanied every sound they produced. And still, we might feel biased towards the pianos of the past and view them as inadequate instruments. But we can't forget that the Pleyels that Chopin admired so much were to his ears the best instruments ever conceived. The rise of historical instruments in recent years is, to me, a welcome change. Becoming acquainted with the instruments that Chopin played offers perspectives about performance that we wouldn't develop were modern pianos the only instruments we had at our disposal. And while the disappearance of the slight reverberation that still characterized the pianos of the 1830s and 40s was deemed an improvement, we might wonder how we can compensate for its loss. Should we consider the abrupt interruption of sound caused by the dampers on modern pianos a limitation or a virtue? We now move on to exploring the word of the left pedal, also known as the una corda pedal, una corda meaning one string. Its history is fascinating, and I'll dedicate a separate video to it. The inscription una corda originated with Beethoven when he received a piano from Broadwood, the English piano maker, as a gift in 1817. On this model, the left pedal, today also called the shift pedal because it shifts the keyboard to the right when depressing it, moved the hammers to such a degree that they hit only one string instead of the three strings they usually did when it was not engaged, hence the marking una corda, one string. The outcome was a sound that was not only softer but also mellower and sometimes nasal in tone. Its use was meant to produce special effects, particularly when a delicate, dreamy sound was intended. How did Chopin use the left pedal? Well, we actually don't know, because Chopin did not mark its use a single time. However, we know from Jan Kleczyński, a Polish pianist and music critic, but also known for his influential writings on Chopin, that, quote, Chopin frequently passed, and without transition, from the open to the soft pedal, especially in enharmonic modulations. We don't know where Kleczyński got this information, but because his sources were generally reliable witnesses, such as Julian Fontana, I assume we should believe him. What did Kleczyński mean by enharmonic modulations? He meant when the music shifted unexpectedly from major to its parallel minor, for example, from C major to C minor. Here's one example from Chopin's Barcarolle. Another moment, this time from the Mazurka in A minor, opus 59, number 1, shows this in reverse, from minor to major. In this second example, we see how Chopin inscribed the change to A major with the marking sottovoce, in Italian meaning whispering. This is significant because as we try to make sense of Kleczyński's words, Chopin frequently passed and without transition from the open to the soft pedal, especially in enharmonic modulations, we can then infer that he would have used the left pedal when the marking sotto voce appears. Could this be a clue that each time we see the marking sotto voce, the left pedal then should be engaged? After noticing this instance, I began to notice also that Chopin most of the time introduces the marking sotto voce without specifying a dynamic marking. While this is not consistently true, in many cases sotto voce appears on its own, either at the beginning of a piece or of a new section, or whenever what Klechinsky calls an enharmonic modulation occurs. What's striking is that in many instances in which the marking sotto voce appears, the context in the phrase or section that precedes is that of piano. Case in point, the example we just viewed in the Mazurka in A minor from Opus 59. Here are a few other examples proceeding in chronological order and starting with the Nocturne in F sharp major Opus 15 number 2, written in 1832. Here the middle section is marked sotto voce. Another case is found in a piece written more or less at the same time, and which we discussed earlier, the Mazurka in A minor, Opus 17, number 4. The coda presents two main phrases, the second one of which is a varied version of the first. This iteration is accompanied by the inscription sotto voce, where piano is the context. The Scherzo in B minor Opus 20 from 1835, again, another case in which sotto voce does not appear accompanied by a dynamic marking, but where the context is that of piano from the preceding episode. Now, it's not that every single appearance of the marking is preceded by a piano, but there are many cases where that occurs. The second theme of the Ballade in G minor, Opus 23, is accompanied by pianissimo, the first time the dynamic is presented in the piece. In the Mazurka in C major, Opus 24, number 2, the piece opens in sotto voce without a dynamic marking. Also, notice the inscription in measure 5, il basso sempre legato, meaning the entire section should be played by using extreme legato playing to connect the left-hand chords, because here the pedal is not used. The ending of the etude in G sharp minor, Opus 25, number 6, features a sotto voce tucked between the closing of a diminuendo and the final forte. Another case of sotto voce placed at the beginning of a piece without a dynamic marking is found in the Scherzo in B flat minor, Opus 31. In the same scherzo, Chopin transitions to the middle section through a sudden harmonic modulation to A major, marked sottovoce. I'd like to open a brief parenthesis in regard to this moment in the scherzo and explore the pedal marking that Chopin wrote before the modulation to A major, a pedal marking that most pianists ignore in two respects. The first is its subjective length, which, as we saw already quite a few times at this point, is based on the harmonic premises of the passage. The harmony doesn't change, nor does the pedal. But there's another aspect that is also overlooked, and it's the placement of the release marking. Here, the manuscript that Chopin prepared for the publication of the French edition shows that the pedal should be held all the way to the opening chord of the middle section. The first French and German editions indicate the same. Yet, somehow, along the way, several editions began to print the release earlier. I believe there's a visual element that intervenes, even when using editions that report the pedal release correctly. The key change, which takes up quite a bit of space, separates the end of the measure where the pedal is released and the beginning of the first measure in the new key. However, the way Chopin marked the pedal seems to indicate that no separation was intended. The finale from the sonata in B-flat minor opus 35, which we discussed earlier because of the marking legato, should also be played by using the left pedal, since Chopin accompanies the marking legato with the marking sottovoce, no sustain pedal, but with the left pedal. We now go to one of the pieces that Chopin published at the end of his life, the Mazurka in C-sharp minor, opus 63, number 3. Here, too, the middle section is marked sottovoce with no dynamics suggested, but coming from a context of piano. For a few years, sometime between the Sonata Opus 35 and the Mazurka we just saw, Chopin stopped using sottovoce. It's an unusual circumstance, and other markings began to appear in his works, such as mezza voce and dolce. Chopin had used dolce before, but perhaps it now took center stage as a marking that illustrated the use of the left pedal, particularly when appearing as dolcissimo, especially after a diminuendo. Here is an example in the Nocturne in B major, opus 62, number 1. With these considerations, we conclude the third video on pedal in Chopin. Feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments section, and of course, if you end up liking any of these videos, feel free to subscribe to the Chopin channel. See you next time.